Pues muchísimas gracias. Si tenía coraje, presentaría mi discurso en español, pero no tengo coraje, prefiero precisión, entonces voy a hablar en inglés. Thank you very much for your gracious introduction and for having me here today. I am delighted, and I look forward to your questions when I conclude, and I hope they will all be very difficult ones. As we heard from Phil Howard and others earlier, we are living through a true epidemic of misleading, malevolent, purposeful, deceitful, and false news. The problem is, as we know, it is often camouflaged as legitimate news, and from tabloid fare suggesting deep state conspiracies to deep fake videos that can literally put words in the mouths of presidents and prime ministers. The plague of misinformation and disinformation, a plague, now threatens to infect populations around the world, actually is doing so. So citizens and news consumers have a lot of work to do if they're going to build stronger immune systems against this disease. And that's what I'd like to talk about with you today. People will need to be more informed and more engaged with their news. They will need to recognize that content comes from a vast array of sources and platforms, traditional and non-traditional reporters, advocates and activists, talk show hosts and opinionated experts or pseudo-experts, troll factories and bots, conspiracy theorists, provocateurs intending to misinform for kicks or to malign for intent, and especially hostile governments who want to deliberately distort and misinform in order to sow confusion and discord and more. So how can consumers, many of them already deeply distrustful of the media, navigate? How can they identify quality journalism, and distinguish well-sourced, credible information from fictitious, unsubstantiated, or malevolent information? What should readers, viewers, and listeners look for as they try to be more informed and trusting consumers of news? And what should news organizations be doing as part of their end of the deal? It starts with, I think, an awareness of the stakes and the dimension of the problem, because absent some background information and awareness, this is purely an academic conversation. We know that hoaxes and fabrication and fabricated news have been around for a very long time. By today's standards, the fictitious fare of established tabloids, though, seems almost quaint, right? Abductions from Mars, drunk dogs alongside stories that a prostitute murdered Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, that Brad Pitt had it in for Angelina Jolie. This all seems pretty benign. Conspiracy theories have drawn audiences throughout history. We know that as well. You've probably heard that FDR secretly knew Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that the US government had a hand in the 9/11 attacks, and that the CIA is behind just about everything. But today, with the amplification and audiences of social media and the content delivered to our digital doorsteps without any filtering, with the legitimate look and sound of so much stuff, with the sourcing of it, as we saw from Phil's presentation, there is this unprecedented foothold that this material can gain. A blogger in Macedonia, a mischief maker in Moscow can fabricate a story, make a video, share a phony article that looks exactly like one from established websites or news organizations. News consumers must be doing something that they are not. Be constantly aware and newly vigilant. They must be able to distinguish, recognize fact from fiction and from opinion, understand what constitutes credible journalism, know how to spot blatantly false or unreliable news, no matter where it comes from. That is a very tall and perhaps impossible order. They must also understand, I think, the motivations of those who originate the polluted information that infects the airwaves and digital domains around us. False stories, as we have seen, are propelled by a highly charged narrative. They're incredible stories often that reinforce strongly held emotions, fears, or beliefs. Many of you may be aware of this. On November 16th, 2016, a headline on omnithought.org screamed, "Pizzagate," how 4chan uncovered the sick world of Washington's occult elite. Stan knows this. The infamous Pizzagate story ricocheted through social media. It alleged that Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton and her former campaign chairman were running a child sex ring from the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria, Comet Ping Pong. I ate a really good pizza from this place not too long afterwards. There was no child sex ring. In fact, there is no basement. This was completely made up. But Edgar Welch, having read the stories online, decided that he should investigate the problem himself. So he got in his car, he drove 350 miles from his home in North Carolina, walked into Comet Ping Pong, and fired an assault rifle. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but false news could have had fatal results. Far less dangerous, but just as challenging for news consumers is partisan content that is funded by advocates, activists, and think tanks. This is designed to look and sound like independent news reporting. It uses language, titles, and the look of traditional news, and it adds to consumer confusion, but it is merely intended to inform and persuade, to convince, to bring to a point of view, or to present a point of view. So these are some of the different sources of this stuff. But it's all background noise compared to the egregious assault of phony, false, and hateful stories blasted from around the world, from hostile governments, from those who just want to sow discord. The most prominent example, of course, in the United States is this unrelenting fusillade of false news that comes from Russia and elsewhere, as we're now slowly uncovering and learning more concerning the 2016 presidential campaign. U.S. intelligence agencies and researchers who've dug into it have concluded that the evidence points to alarming and pervasive efforts, misinformation, false news, insidious propaganda. Russian operatives bought thousands of ads on Facebook, posted videos and stories, created memes and bogus identities. Jonathan Albright, research director of the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, researched Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. He estimates that Russian bought Facebook pages and accounts were shared hundreds of millions of times. He found Russian disinformation on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, Google. He describes the effort as cultural hacking and told the New York Times, his words, "They are using systems that were already set up by these platforms to increase engagement. They're feeding outrage. It's easy to do," he says, because outrage and emotion is how people share. So it's one of the leverage points. Now, just a quick aside, when I was the bureau chief at CNN, we had a firm policy that we would never put information on the air that came from a source outside of CNN unless either we could confirm it independently or there were two identifiable sources within the story or elsewhere that we knew or could identify and verify or had confidence in to legitimize that story. That policy no longer exists. That policy no longer exists because the calculation has been made at CNN and other channels that social media and other media move so quickly that in order to be relevant and to stay constant with the news, you have to be reporting often in real time, even with information that you don't generate yourself. It's what we call the water cooler conversation. So CNN will put information on from another source. So will MSNBC and everybody else now. They will identify where it comes from, but it is a speed of passing on information from others that would have been unthinkable not very many years ago. So this is the world of false news in which we live. Outrage and emotion have become the dominant and corrosive elements so often. Meanwhile, and this is something that should concern all of us, persistent attacks on legitimate journalism and media have added to existing distrust and led to a genuine crisis of confidence in truth-seeking journalism. From the US to the UK, conservative media and politicians have found a ready audience and genuine traction by attacking mainstream, fake, dishonest media. They criticize not just the quality of the journalism and the coverage, which is fair enough to attack the quality, but they attack the motivations behind that, suggesting that media are part of some grand conspiracy, a deep state, an opposition party, dishonest, pursuing their own nefarious agenda. I remember covering President Reagan several years ago now, when I was very small, at a speech he gave in the Soviet Union, where he went out of his way to defend a free press as one of the fundamental cornerstones of a democracy. I have a hat that I got when covering the re-election bid of President George Bush, the first Bush, and it said, "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." Criticizing the media was fair and has long been fair. Attacking it as an enemy or opposition party is new. An adversarial relationship and thinking of the media as an adversary is one thing. Framing it as an enemy is altogether something different. The internet, social media, iPhone videos, and the tools of media that are now in the hands of billions of citizens around the world have truly leveled the playing field. Anyone can capture an image, record an event, interview an eyewitness, and be a citizen reporter. But not everyone can be a journalist. And the distinction is important and part of the diet, I think, that news consumers are going to need to have if they're going to be healthy consumers of information. Not everyone can be a journalist because not everyone knows, recognizes, or plays by the rules commonly recognized as pillars of professional journalism, right? Accuracy, discipline of verification, pursuit of truth, and accountability if you get it wrong. Holding a pen and having an opinion, recording a conversation, or pointing a camera does not convey journalist status any more than removing a splinter lets you claim to be a doctor, or cooking a meal confers status as a chef. So we have to be careful how we talk about citizen journalism. And news consumers need to know the difference because this is where their information is coming from. Ben Nemo, an information defense fellow with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab, has been studying disinformation in the media for nearly 20 years. He's most concerned about the kind of fake news that, in his words, plants false information and evil intent. He calls it hyper-emotional interpretation. Hyper-emotional interpretation. And he points out that, for example, social media trolls in St. Petersburg triggered a confrontation between pro-Muslim and anti-Islam demonstrators in Texas in May of 2016. The standoff ended without bloodshed, but it showed Russia's ability to weaponize the anger of American citizens thousands of miles away. It's what Russian military calls the protest potential of the population, he explains. And he points to paragraph 15A in Russia's 2014 military doctrine. I doubt that many of us are expert in it. I looked it up just to be sure he was correct. And it actually notes that the characteristics of military conflict involve and include what they call informational or other non-military measures implemented with a wide use of protest potential of the population. Churn people up, get them out, generate protest. So it's against this pernicious backdrop of information from so many sources, hostility towards the media, attacks upon it by leadership, that we operate. And hardly surprising that people have become so suspicious of the information they consume. A 2017 Gallup survey on confidence in institutions found, for example, that Americans, only about a quarter of Americans have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspaper or television news. A Pew Research Center survey taken shortly after the 2016 election found that 64%, nearly two-thirds of Americans, felt fabricated news stories cause a great deal of confusion about the basic facts of current events and issues. Nearly a third said they often see made-up political news online. And only 5% of adults who got their news from social media said they had a lot of trust in the information they were consuming, leading me to wonder why they're still consuming it at all. A brand new Edelman survey that was just released, I think 2 or 3 days ago, surveyed 9,000 people in 9 countries around the world and found additional and declining trust in social media. 41% internationally now saying they trust social media for their news and information. In the United States, that number is even lower. 30% in the US say they trust their information. Facebook has launched a multi-pronged effort to disrupt the economic incentives of this kind of behind this misleading information, to come up with new tools, in their words, to curb the spread of false news, to help people, in their words, make more informed decisions when they encounter false news. And what is Facebook doing? A number of things, but their biggest bet is on the community of readers and viewers to be more active, aware, engaged, and vigilant themselves. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, said the company would prioritize news that is trustworthy, informative, and local. And he said these trusted sources would not be determined by Facebook editors or algorithms or some outside panel of judges, even though they're doing all of that. Rather, he said, the Facebook community, citizens, through quality surveys, would rate the trustworthiness of news organizations and information. Now, whether this is an effective way of tamping down false news, and I rather doubt it, remains unclear. But one thing is clear, that Facebook and other social media companies are unwilling to assume the authoritative gatekeeper role played by editors and producers at traditional news media organizations. I testified before a British parliamentary committee that was in Washington holding hearings on fake news. And Twitter and Facebook and Google were also there. And someone from Twitter said, "We will not be arbiters of the truth." Okay? So the social media are not going to play the gatekeeping roles we now know, and it's very well documented, that journalists have traditionally played. They leave the fact-sorting burden on news consumers. So, if readers and listeners of the news are to be the vanguard of quality, fact-based journalism, what steps can they take to build up their immune systems from this plague of false news? How can they distinguish between legitimate news and deliberately fictitious or misleading news? How can citizens contribute to an information environment that is less polluted by the foul runoff from troll factories and bots? What should news consumers look for? And what should they find conspicuous by its absence? Okay? First, consumers must understand the basic ingredients of accurate evidence-based reporting, and news organizations have to help with this in clear, accessible, and consistent ways. Responsible reporting news consumers must know, whether from news organizations whose editorial pages lean left, right, or independent sources, must include several basic, non-negotiable ingredients. 1, a dedication to truth and accuracy. 2, a culture of verification and sourcing. 3, editorial vetting, checking, and challenge. 4, a commitment to represent differing points of view. Maybe that one should be number 1, a commitment to represent differing points of view. 5, procedures to acknowledge and correct errors. And finally, a code of conduct and some public face that explains and guides journalists' behavior, explains their own accountability, and provides transparency into their own process. These should be the first items on any checklist. They should be clearly labeled and publicly accessible. the Wall Street Journal, NPR, ProPublica, the New York Times, American news organizations all post their ethics and news practices online. All news organizations should follow suit, and consumers should see and consult those practices so that they understand the standards and the values that govern those news organizations. The Federation of Spanish Press Code of Ethics, also posted online, states explicitly the first obligation of a journalist is to respect the truth. The public needs to see and understand these things. We talk so much about journalism and journalism ethics, and we somehow, within the profession, and I fear sometimes within academia, assume that the public just understands that and understands the value. Well, journalism is a cornerstone to democracy. Free speech is a corner, and we assume that people understand what that means. I think that is a naive assumption. News organizations should publish a coherent policy on sourcing so that news consumers can know, understand, and trust where and how source information is gathered and reported. So the Washington Post's policies and standards online spells out this approach in considerable and specific detail. It says, we must be truthful about the source of our information. Facts and quotations in a story that were not produced by our own reporting must be attributed. Attribution of material from other media must be total. Plagiarism is not permitted. I'm glad to hear that. The Post goes so far as to explain the difference between on-the-record background, deep background, and off-the-record sourcing. Its stated goal, again, their words, is clarity in our dealings with sources and readers. This means explaining our ground rules to sources and giving readers as much information as possible about how we learned the information in our stories. If you go to the Washington Post online and you go to opinion pieces, just above the author's byline, you will see the word perspective. If you hover on that word perspective, the following words drop down. Perspective, discussion of news topics with a point of view, including by individuals regarding their own experiences. In other words, this is opinion, making clear for people, news consumers, the distinction, or trying to. News consumers must also learn that the best reporting, and they should look for this, involves multiple, named, knowledgeable sources with direct access to issues and information relevant to the story. So they should look for, news consumers should look for, in the copy or elsewhere, sources' backgrounds, agendas, which news organizations should plainly convey, along with the information about whether the sources are decision makers, partisans, loyalists, adversaries, experts, or eyewitnesses. Much more clarity in who is speaking, providing quotes and perspective. When it comes to unnamed sources, news consumers should look for and expect explanation as to why the sources are anonymous, and still their proximity to the story. Many news organizations have decided to use fewer anonymous sources and provide as much background as possible when they're essential to the story, indicating the source's agenda, degree of direct knowledge, professional background, or ideological persuasion. When I was bureau chief at CNN, I had an arrangement with a reporter if we were going to go on the air with an unnamed source. And we jokingly referred to it as the cone of silence. And I'd say, if you're going to go on the air with an unnamed source, step into my cone of silence, please, and tell me who that source is. That's so we know, you know, so there can be some form of vetting. I will go to my grave and never reveal that source. And sometimes the reporter wouldn't reveal the source, and sometimes we then decline to go on the air with it. But some sort of vetting within organizations must take place, and news consumers should know that. They should understand these internal processes because it would give them more confidence in them. How can readers, viewers, and listeners spot or suspect a bogus unnamed source? They should look for unsubstantiated claims, highly emotional appeals or accusations, name-calling or demonizing, quotes that are too good, too pithy, or too dark to be true. They should be wary of sources who are granted anonymity and use the cover to allege devious cover-ups or conspiracy theories without any evidence whatsoever. They should be suspicious of sources who make sensational claims, attribute motives to political enemies in a story that lacks corroboration from any other source. News consumers must look for, news organizations must provide a news organization explanation for a news organization's process for assessing anonymous sources and determining whether the information they possess is or reaches a threshold where anonymity is warranted. We hear so often this distrust in news organizations because they're always using unnamed sources. The investigative news organization ProPublica, on its news site, provides explicit guidance about unnamed sources. It says, quoting here, "Editors have an obligation to know the identity of unnamed sources in our stories, so that editors and reporters can jointly assess the appropriateness of using their information, and sources need to understand this practice." ProPublica's commitment to transparency is really exemplary. Its clarity and detail should provide a roadmap for both news organizations and consumers and set the standard for the industry. Still, no matter how informed the reader is or how much trust a news organization engenders, there are going to be bad days, really, really bad days. Mistakes and bad reporting are journalists' worst nightmares. They misinform the audience, they damage credibility, they erode trust, but they happen because this is a human endeavor. And because stories change. I was on the air at CNN for the Oklahoma City bombing. I was told by virtually the highest source in law enforcement in the moment, who insisted on anonymity, by the way, that law enforcement in the United States was looking for 2 individuals of Middle Eastern descent who may have been connected with the bombing. That was the information that law enforcement was actually working off of at that moment. It turned out to be false. It was given to me by the highest source imaginable, and I reported it. It was wrong, all right? It wasn't actually bad reporting, it was good reporting, but it was based on changing information. That too happens. So these things take place. Sometimes the inaccuracy is innocent and minor. A reporter will transpose a number or confuse a timeline of events or apply a statistic or name incorrectly, but some errors are egregious. An unethical reporter makes up a quote, or a reporting team overlooks evidence or leaps to conclusions to allege wrongdoing. So all these things happen. Trustworthy news organizations have systems in place to acknowledge and correct these errors and hold themselves and their reporters accountable. I can't count the number of times that this issue early in the Trump administration came up of a reporter who reported that the bust of Martin Luther King had been removed from the Oval Office. And this was used as great evidence of journalistic malfeasance. The reporter didn't see it at the time, reported it, but it was quickly corrected. The actual error was quickly corrected. So at least there was some form of accountability here. CNN has actually fired people for getting information wrong. ProPublica, again, online, states to its readers, anytime a question of fairness or accuracy is raised about any aspect of our work, whether by a source, subject, or member of the public, the reporters involved should discuss the issue with their supervising editor, decide what response is warranted. When mistakes are made, they need to be corrected fully, quickly, and ungrudgingly. News consumers should be looking for this. News consumers should recognize, and will have to train themselves, and we have to help, to recognize the difference between news and opinion. Amid the glut of online news, analysis, commentary, Snapchats, and tweets, competing with the talk-soaked world of cable television, radio, and podcast, there may be no line that has become more blurred than that between information and opinion. If you go to iTunes today, there are more than 500,000 podcasts available. There's this explosion of content. How to navigate all of that? Serious news organizations, whatever the medium, should clearly and prominently label coverage. And they should ask themselves a whole bunch of questions along the way about their placement, purpose, and optics. On a mobile device, do opinion pieces intermingle with reported news stories? Can an untrained reader tell the difference? On television, is a news reporter sitting right next to a commentator? And are they engaging with one another? If everyone is clearly identified, will the viewer be able to identify that the person with the opinion is a person with an opinion and the reporter is a reporter, and what that even means? Are reporters being encouraged to take opinions, to take positions and state opinions? The point here is that consumers must know of and use a variety of tools to become more news literate and more discerning. News organizations must commit themselves to offering these tools to explain what they do, how they do it, what goes into it, and what perspective it represents. I have also argued, mostly unsuccessfully, that every news organization should have an ombudsman, a public editor, or someone to directly interact and explain to the public. I think news consumers should have a checklist. We should all have a checklist to spot bogus news and slow its spread. So here are a few suggestions. First, we should be trained not to like, share, or retweet, or otherwise promote through social media a news story unless we know and trust the source and check our checklist. If you don't know the site or organization, originator of the information, do a search to see if it's a partisan player or of any suspicious origin. Check the web address, looking for unusual numbers, dashes, abbreviations, or foreign countries. News consumers should click About Us with news organizations or others, especially they don't know, to see if there is a description of the organization, names or profiles of its executives, reporters, senior editors, or producers. Click Contact Us, if there's something there, such as Contact Us, to see if there actually are contacts, numbers, and addresses. Consult fact checkers, such as Snopes, PolitiFact, factcheck.org, to see if the organization or the site has been called out for inaccurate reporting in the past. Look at the particulars of the story internally. Some very basic things that we all know. Is there a date, a byline, a date line? From the byline, can you click through and see an actual bio of a reporter? Does she or he have a track record of work? Within the stories, are there links to other sources that actually provide documentation, independent documentation for what is being reported? Does the story, and I think this is a big one and an easy one, does the story feature any opposing voices? Is there a reality check or healthy skepticism, or does the story simply parrot a particular point of view throughout? Are sources named or unnamed? And if they're named, have you heard of them? If they're unnamed, is there an explanation why? Ads, do the ads give it away? If a story is populated by lots of pop-up ads and ads that feature sensational headlines, sexual innuendo, the content may be a little more than revenue-generating clickbait. Read laterally. I love this. Stanford University researchers Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew urged news consumers to actually follow the example of professional fact-checkers and to read laterally. Open a series of tabs as you go, right? Googling other stories, sites, and references, clicking on links and footnotes to check sources, and finally read, watch, and consume multiple sources and news organizations to see if this stuff, especially if it's particularly incendiary, is legitimized elsewhere. This is a great checklist, and it is completely unrealistic because this represents so much work for news consumers. They are so unlikely to do this. News consumers who once just opened a newspaper or watched the evening news and considered the source familiar to a remarkable degree, trustworthy, can no longer do that and don't. So increasingly, citizens who care about the quality of the information they consume and who want to promote a society where opinions and decisions are based on fact and truth are going to separate themselves. And they will be those who are proactive, are engaged. What about the rest? Which is why news organizations and those committed to fact-based information are going to need to redouble their efforts and to market the quality of their information in new ways. The stakes here are huge, and I think, Stan, you kind of laid that out as we thought about who's engaged and where they're coming from. Stanford researchers Hunt Alcott and Matthew Gensko examined the relationship of social media and fake news in the 2016 election, and they identified 4 distinct consequences that false, misleading, or deliberately fictitious news have on political discourse and governance. First, they said, consumers who mistake a fake outlet for a legitimate one have less accurate beliefs. Less accurate beliefs. Second, because less accurate beliefs affect decision-making, false news may hurt democracy by undermining, their words, the ability of the democratic process to select high-quality candidates. The proliferation of false news, they say, may also drive consumers to become more skeptical of legitimate news producers, to the extent that they become hard to distinguish from fake news producers. Finally, and worryingly, a reduced demand for high-precision, low-bias reporting will reduce the incentives to invest in accurate reporting. What does that mean? That means that the financial returns, the clicks, the eyeballs are coming from people who are more interested in more salacious news than in information and fact-based news. After all, if opinion and debate shows drive ratings and profits, why bother producing a news show that will require more time and effort and be less lucrative? Think of it this way. In the United States now, with all the cable news channels we have, there is virtually no news program in the traditional sense of a television news show on anywhere in prime time. It's almost all talk and opinion. Now, there are some hopeful signs, strong signals from a number of high-precision news organizations indicating there remains a significant appetite for this kind of quality news. Despite all the attacks, the New York Times is way up, NPR in the States way up, here as well. Fake news has been around for as long as people have had something to suspect, say, sell, or lie about. And governments have engaged in propaganda through the ages. Conspiracy theories have long proved contagious, so now we just do them faster and more convincingly. But in our social media, always-on digital world, the amount, the velocity of this fabricated news are unprecedented. As we've seen, this epidemic is real, and the consequences can cause very serious damage. News organizations, I think, are going to have to work harder than ever and redouble their commitments to deliver the quality work that they promise, and even more, and this is very uncomfortable for most news organizations, to explain themselves more fully and to market themselves in a way that does not only sound self-serving, but is also truly informative to an audience. And it's going to fall to each citizen and news consumer to take the steps necessary to develop these fake news immune systems. Otherwise, I think we're going to become so disoriented by our illness that we will not be able to tell fact from fiction, news from opinion, or democracy from autocracy. We talk so much about how pivotal a free press is in democracies. I think the time has come, and we're going to have to invest in that much, much more, both as news and media organizations and as news-consuming citizens. Thank you very much.